The dust kicked up around Maeve Langford's worn boots as she burst through the courthouse doors in Hecla, Montana. Her dark hair coming loose from its pins, her chest heaving with exertion and desperation. She had run the entire mile from the ranch after receiving word that her brother Thomas had been arrested for a crime he did not commit. And now she stood before Judge Cornelius Whitmore with tears streaming down her sun-kissed cheeks, her hands clasped together as though in prayer. "Please, Your Honor," she gasped, her voice breaking. "My brother is innocent. He would never steal horses from the Chapman Ranch. He was with me all day mending fences on our property. Mr. Chapman has hated our family ever since my father refused to sell him our water rights 3 years ago. This is revenge, nothing more." Judge Whitmore, a portly man with silver whiskers and cold eyes, leaned back in his chair and studied her with obvious disinterest. It was August of 1883, and the heat in the courtroom was oppressive, making Maeve's cotton dress cling to her skin. Several townspeople had gathered to watch the proceedings, fanning themselves and whispering behind their hands. "Miss Langford," the judge said slowly, drawing out each syllable as if speaking to a child. "Mr. Chapman is one of the most respected ranchers in this county. He has 3 witnesses who saw your brother on his property the night those horses disappeared. I find it hard to believe that a man of his standing would fabricate such accusations." "But he is fabricating them," Maeve cried out, stepping closer to the bench. The bailiff moved forward, but the judge waved him back. "Those witnesses work for Chapman. They will say whatever he tells them to say. My brother has never stolen anything in his life. Our father raised us to be honest, God-fearing people." The judge shuffled some papers on his desk, clearly eager to be done with this matter. "Your father is dead, Miss Langford, and your ranch is failing. Perhaps your brother saw an opportunity to improve your circumstances." "We are not thieves," Maeve said firmly, though her voice trembled with emotion. "Set a bond, Your Honor. Whatever you think is fair, I will pay it. Just please do not send Thomas to prison for something he did not do." Whitmore stroked his whiskers thoughtfully. "Very well. Bond is set at $500. If you can produce that sum, your brother may await trial at home. Otherwise, he will remain in the county jail." The amount hit Maeve like a physical blow. $500 might as well have been 5,000. Since her father's death 2 years ago, she and Thomas had struggled to keep the ranch afloat. They had barely scraped together enough money to buy seed for the spring planting. There was no way she could raise such a sum. "Your Honor," she began again, her voice desperate now. "Surely you can see that we do not have that kind of money. Please, I am begging you, lower the bond. Make it something I can actually pay." "The bond is set," Whitmore said with finality, bringing his gavel down. "Next case." Maeve stood frozen for a moment, unable to process what had just happened. Then she was moving forward again, reaching toward the judge. "Please, I am begging you. He is all the family I have left. You cannot do this. Please." The bailiff grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "That is enough, miss. You need to leave now." "No, Your Honor, please. I will do anything. I will work off the debt. I will sign over the ranch. Just please do not leave my brother in that cell." Her voice had risen to a near scream, and she could feel the eyes of every person in the courtroom upon her, but she did not care. Thomas was her younger brother, only 20 years old, and the thought of him locked away for a crime he did not commit was more than she could bear. "Remove her," the judge ordered, his face reddening with anger. The bailiff was dragging her toward the door when a deep voice rang out from the back of the courtroom. "I will pay the bond." Everyone turned to look at the speaker. Maeve, still struggling against the bailiff's grip, craned her neck to see who had spoken. A tall man stood near the entrance, his broad-shouldered frame silhouetted against the bright sunlight streaming through the open door. As he walked forward, removing his dusty hat, Maeve could see that he was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair and startling blue eyes set in a tanned, weathered face. He wore typical cowboy attire, denim trousers, a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, and boots that had seen many miles of hard use. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, squinting at the newcomer. "And who might you be, sir?" "Sterling Rafferty," the man replied, his voice calm and steady. "I have a ranch about 15 miles north of here. I heard about the Langford case and came to see what all the fuss was about. You are willing to pay $500 for the release of a man accused of horse theft." The judge's tone was skeptical. "That is a considerable sum to risk on a stranger." Sterling's blue eyes met Maeve's for a moment, and she felt something shift in her chest, though she could not have said what it was. Then he looked back at the judge. "I know the Chapman family, Your Honor. I also knew Samuel Langford before he passed. He was a good man, and I find it hard to believe his children would turn to thievery. I am willing to take the risk." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Maeve felt her legs go weak beneath her, and if the bailiff had not still been holding her arm, she might have collapsed. This stranger was going to pay her brother's bond. It made no sense. She had never even seen him before today. Judge Whitmore looked displeased but could not refuse. "Very well, Mr. Rafferty. If you are certain about this foolish decision, you may post the bond with the clerk. Miss Langford, your brother will be released into your custody. However, he must appear for trial in 3 weeks' time, or Mr. Rafferty will forfeit his money and you will both be arrested. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Maeve whispered, hardly able to believe what was happening. Thank you so much." The judge waved her away dismissively and called for the next case. The bailiff released her arm, and Maeve stumbled toward the back of the courtroom where Sterling Rafferty stood waiting. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the scar along his jawline, the calluses on his strong hands. He was handsome in a rugged, unpolished way, and there was something in his steady gaze that made her feel both safe and deeply unsettled. "Mr. Rafferty," she began, her voice shaking, "I do not know what to say. I cannot possibly repay you. $500 is more money than I will see in years, but I swear to you my brother will appear for trial. I give you my word." "I know he will," Sterling said simply. He placed his hat back on his head and gestured toward the door. "Let us get your brother out of that cell." They walked together to the clerk's office, where Sterling counted out the bond money in crisp bills that he produced from inside his vest. Maeve watched in amazement, wondering what kind of man carried such a sum on his person. The clerk prepared the release papers, and within an hour, Thomas was walking out of the county jail, blinking in the bright afternoon sunlight. He was thinner than Maeve remembered, his sandy hair disheveled, his clothes rumpled and dirty, but his green eyes, so like their father's, were bright with relief when he saw her. "Maeve!" He rushed forward and pulled her into a tight embrace. "I knew you would come. I knew you would not let them keep me in there." "Oh, Thomas," Maeve said, holding him close and fighting back tears. "I am so sorry. I tried to convince the judge, but he would not listen. If it were not for Mr. Rafferty here, you would still be locked up." Thomas pulled back and looked at Sterling with confusion and gratitude. "Mr. Rafferty, I do not believe we have met." Sterling extended his hand, and Thomas shook it firmly. "Sterling Rafferty, I have a ranch north of here. Your sister was quite persuasive in her arguments to the judge. I decided to help." "You paid my bond?" Thomas asked, his eyes widening. "But why? You do not even know me." "I knew your father," Sterling said, which was not entirely true but seemed the easiest explanation. "He had a good reputation, that counts for something." Thomas looked overwhelmed. I do not know how we will ever repay you, but I swear I will find a way. Every penny. It may take time, but you will get your money back. We can discuss that later, Sterling said. Right now, I expect you both could use some food and rest. Have you eaten today, Miss Langford? Maeve realized she could not remember the last time she had eaten. She had been so focused on getting to the courthouse that food had been the last thing on her mind. I am fine, she said automatically, though her stomach chose that moment to growl loudly enough for both men to hear. Sterling's lips quirked in what might have been a smile, though it was gone so quickly Maeve was not sure she had actually seen it. There is a restaurant down the street. Let me buy you both a meal. Mr. Rafferty, you have already done so much, Maeve protested. We cannot ask you to do more. You are not asking, I am offering. His tone was firm but not unkind. Come on, you will need your strength for whatever comes next. Maeve exchanged a glance with Thomas, who shrugged helplessly. They followed Sterling down the dusty main street of Hecla to a small restaurant called Martha's Kitchen. The proprietor, a plump woman with graying hair and a kind face, showed them to a table near the window. The place was nearly empty, as it was between the lunch and dinner rushes. Sterling ordered roast beef, potatoes, and vegetables for all three of them, along with fresh bread and coffee. When the food arrived, Maeve tried to eat slowly and maintain her dignity, but she was so hungry that she found herself devouring everything on her plate. Thomas ate with equal enthusiasm, and Sterling watched them both with what might have been amusement. When did you last have a proper meal? He asked quietly. Maeve felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. We have been managing just fine, she said defensively. The ranch has been difficult since Father died, but we are getting by. Getting by is not the same as thriving, Sterling observed. He took a sip of his coffee. What happened? Your father had a good spread from what I heard, Thomas answered before Maeve could stop him. Father died in an accident 2 years ago. He was breaking a horse and got thrown, hit his head on a rock. After that, things fell apart. We lost some cattle to disease, had a bad crop year, and then the bank started pressing us for payment on a loan Father had taken out to buy new equipment. We have been barely holding on ever since. Thomas, Maeve said sharply, wishing he would not share their private troubles with this stranger, no matter how helpful he had been. But Sterling did not look judgmental or pitying. He simply nodded as if he had heard similar stories many times before. It is hard to work a ranch with just 2 people, especially when one of them is a woman. No offense intended, Miss Langford, but cattle and horses do not care about determination. They need strong hands and experience. I am stronger than I look, Maeve said, lifting her chin. And I have been working that ranch since I was 12 years old. I know what I am doing. I do not doubt that, Sterling said, but there are some jobs that simply require more muscle than you can provide. Have you thought about hiring help? With what money? Thomas asked bitterly. We can barely afford to feed ourselves, let alone pay workers. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Maeve pushed her empty plate away and folded her hands in her lap. Mr. Rafferty, I want to thank you again for what you did today. I do not understand why you helped us, and I do not know how we will ever repay you, but I promise we will find a way. Thomas will appear for his trial, and he will be exonerated, and then somehow we will get you your money back. Sterling was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those intense blue eyes. Finally, he said, What if I told you there was a way you could work off the debt? Maeve felt her heartbeat quicken. What do you mean? I have a large ranch, over 2,000 acres. I run about 500 head of cattle and breed horses as well. I have hired hands, but I could always use more help. If you and your brother came to work for me, I would pay you fair wages. It would take time, but eventually you could work off what I paid for the bond. Work for you?" Thomas repeated, leaning forward with interest. "You would hire us?" "I would," Sterling confirmed. "You would have room and board plus wages. The work is hard, but no harder than what you are already doing on your own ranch." Maeve's mind was racing. It was a generous offer, perhaps too generous. "What about our ranch? We cannot just abandon it. Can you afford to keep it?" Sterling asked bluntly. The question hung in the air like a weight. Maeve wanted to say yes, wanted to insist that they could manage, but the truth was that they were drowning. The bank had been threatening foreclosure for months. Without Thomas there to help with the heavy work, she would lose everything anyway. "I do not know," she admitted quietly, the words tasting like defeat. Sterling leaned back in his chair. "Think about it. You do not have to decide right now. But the offer stands. If you want to accept, you are welcome at the Rafferty Ranch anytime." "The Rafferty Ranch," Thomas said thoughtfully. "I have heard of it. Some of the men in town talk about it. They say you have one of the finest operations in Montana." "I have worked hard to build something good," Sterling said simply. "And I treat my people well. You would not regret coming to work for me." Maeve looked at her brother and saw hope flickering in his eyes for the first time in months. The truth was, they did not have many options. If they refused Sterling's offer and tried to continue on their own, they would likely lose the ranch anyway. At least this way they would have steady work and income, and a chance to eventually repay their debt. "Can we have a day to think about it?" she asked. "Of course," Sterling said. "I will be staying at the hotel tonight and heading back to my ranch tomorrow afternoon. If you decide you want to come with me, meet me at the livery stable at 2 o'clock. They finished their coffee in silence, and then Sterling paid for the meal over Maeve's protests. Outside the restaurant, he tipped his hat to them both. "I hope to see you tomorrow, Miss Langford, Thomas, but whatever you decide, I wish you well." He walked away down the street, his long stride eating up the distance. Maeve and Thomas stood watching him go, both lost in their own thoughts. "What do you think?" Thomas asked finally. "I think we do not have much choice," Maeve said, "but there is something about him that troubles me." "What do you mean? He seems like a good man. He paid my bond when he did not have to." "Exactly," Maeve said. "Why would he do that?" "What does he want from us?" Thomas frowned. "Maybe he just wants to help. Maybe he really is just offering us work." "Maybe," Maeve said, but she could not shake the feeling that there was more to Sterling Rafferty than met the eye. Men did not simply hand over $500 to strangers without expecting something in return. Still, what choice did they have? They were out of options and out of time. They borrowed a horse from a friend in town and rode back to their ranch together, Thomas sitting behind Maeve on the saddle. The property looked even more run down than Maeve remembered. The fences were sagging, the barn needed new shingles, and weeds had taken over the vegetable garden. The house itself was small and weathered, with peeling paint and a front porch that tilted slightly to one side. Inside, the furniture was sparse and worn. Maeve had sold most of their nice things over the past 2 years to help pay bills. What remained were the bare essentials: a table and chairs, 2 beds, a cast iron stove, and a few shelves holding chipped dishes and cooking supplies. Thomas collapsed into one of the chairs with a heavy sigh. "It is good to be home, even if home is falling apart." Maeve put a kettle on the stove to make tea. "We need to make a decision about Mr. Rafferty's offer." "I think we should take it," Thomas said immediately. "Maeve, look around. We are losing this place no matter what we do. At least if we go work for him, we will have steady income and a chance to pay off our debts. Maybe we could even save enough to start over somewhere else." "But this is our home," Maeve said, her voice breaking slightly. "Father built this ranch. He wanted us to have it." "Father is gone," Thomas said gently. "And I think he would want us to survive more than he would want us to cling to a dream that is killing us. We have been working ourselves to the bone for 2 years, and we are no better off than when we started. We need help, Maeve. And Mr. Rafferty is offering it." Maeve poured the tea and sat down across from her brother. She knew he was right, but it was hard to let go. This ranch represented everything their father had worked for, everything he had hoped to pass down to his children. Abandoning it felt like betraying his memory. But Thomas was alive and well, sitting across from her, and that was what mattered most. If working for Sterling Rafferty meant keeping her brother safe and giving them both a chance at a better future, then she would do it. "All right," she said. "We will take his offer. Tomorrow at 2 o'clock we will meet him at the livery stable." Thomas reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Thank you, Maeve. I know this is not easy for you, but I think it is the right decision. And who knows? Maybe things will work out better than we expect." That night, Maeve lay in her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. She kept thinking about Sterling Rafferty, about the way he had stepped forward in that courtroom without hesitation, about the calm confidence in his voice, about those blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. He was a mystery, and she did not trust mysteries. But she had no choice except to trust him now. Their future depended on it. The next day, Maeve and Thomas packed what few belongings they had into 2 worn saddlebags. Maeve left a note for their neighbor, asking him to keep an eye on the property and to contact the bank on their behalf. Then they saddled up their 2 remaining horses, both old and tired animals that had seen better days, and rode into town. Sterling was waiting at the livery stable when they arrived, just as he had promised. He had a fine black stallion saddled and ready, and he was checking the animal's hooves when Maeve and Thomas rode up. He straightened and looked at them, and Maeve thought she saw a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes, though it was gone almost instantly. "You decided to come," he said. "We did," Maeve confirmed, dismounting. "We accept your offer, Mr. Rafferty. We will work for you until we have paid off the bond." "Good," Sterling said. He looked at their horses and frowned slightly. "Those animals are not going to make it 15 miles. We will need to get you better mounts." "We cannot afford new horses," Maeve said quickly. "I did not ask you to pay for them," Sterling replied. "Consider it part of your employment. You cannot work on a ranch if you cannot get around the property. I will provide the horses, and you can work off their cost along with everything else." Maeve wanted to protest, but she bit her tongue. They were already so deep in debt to this man that a couple of horses would not make much difference. And he was right. Their old mares would never hold up to the demands of working a large ranch. Sterling arranged for 2 sturdy horses from the livery owner, a grizzled man named Pete who seemed to know him well. "Putting together a new crew, Sterling?" Pete asked with a knowing grin. "Something like that," Sterling replied, counting out money to pay for the horses. "These 2 will do nicely. They are sound, are they not?" "Sound as can be," Pete assured him. "You have a good eye, as always." Within an hour they were riding out of Hecla, heading north along a dusty trail that wound through rolling hills and open grassland. The August sun beat down on them mercilessly, and Maeve was grateful for the wide-brimmed hat she had brought. Sterling rode in front, his posture relaxed but alert, and Maeve found herself studying him when she thought he was not looking. He was clearly a man accustomed to hard work. His shoulders were broad and strong, his hands steady on the reins. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who had spent years in the saddle, and his horse responded to his slightest touch. There was a quietness about him that Maeve found both comforting and unnerving. He did not speak unless he had something worth saying, and when he did speak, his words were measured and thoughtful. They stopped once at a creek to water the horses and rest in the shade of some cottonwood trees. Sterling produced some dried beef and hardtack from his saddlebag and shared it with them. Maeve sat on a rock and watched the water flow by, wondering what she was getting herself into. "How long have you had your ranch?" Thomas asked, clearly trying to make conversation. "About 8 years," Sterling replied. "I came out here from Colorado with some money I had saved and bought the land cheap. It was pretty rough at first, just me and a couple of hired men, but we built it up over time. Now I have a good operation going. What made you come to Montana?" Maeve asked. Sterling was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "I needed a fresh start. Colorado had too many memories." There was something in his tone that discouraged further questions, so Maeve let the subject drop. They finished their brief meal and continued riding. It was late afternoon when they finally reached the Rafferty ranch, and Maeve had to admit she was impressed. The property was vast, with well-maintained fences, a large barn, several outbuildings, and a substantial 2-story house that looked like it had been built within the last few years. Cattle grazed in the distance, and she could see several men working near the barn, their voices carrying across the open space. Sterling led them to the barn, where a weathered man with a thick gray mustache was shoeing a horse. He looked up as they approached, and his face broke into a grin. "Sterling, you are back. Did you have any luck in town?" "I did, Jack," Sterling said, dismounting. "I found the help we need. This is Maeve Langford and her brother Thomas. They will be working with us for a while. Maeve, Thomas, this is Jack Donovan, my foreman. He runs the day-to-day operations around here." Jack wiped his hands on his leather apron and came forward to shake hands with them both. He had kind eyes and a firm grip. "Good to meet you folks. We can always use capable hands around here. You have ranching experience." "We have been running our own place for the past 2 years," Thomas said. "Small operation, but we know the work." "That is good enough for me," Jack said. "Sterling is a fair boss and we have a good crew here. You will fit in just fine." He glanced at Maeve and added, "We do not have many women working the ranch, miss, but if you are willing to pull your weight, nobody will give you trouble. Sterling does not tolerate that kind of nonsense." "I can pull my weight," Maeve assured him. Sterling showed them to the bunkhouse, a long wooden building with rows of beds and a wood-burning stove at one end. Most of the beds were empty at this time of day, as the men were still out working. "You can take any of the empty bunks," he said to Thomas. "Maeve, I will show you to the main house. We have a spare room you can use." Maeve felt her stomach flutter nervously. "I do not want special treatment, Mr. Rafferty. I can sleep in the bunkhouse like everyone else." "The bunkhouse is full of men," Sterling said flatly. "You will have more privacy in the house. It is not special treatment. It is common sense." He did not wait for her to argue further, simply picked up her saddlebag and started walking toward the house. Maeve exchanged a look with Thomas, who shrugged, and then hurried to catch up with Sterling. The inside of the house was surprisingly well appointed. The front room had comfortable furniture, a large stone fireplace, and bookshelves lined with volumes on ranching, history, and literature. The kitchen was spacious and clean, with a large table that could seat at least 8 people. Sterling led her upstairs to a small bedroom at the end of the hall. "This is yours," he said, setting her saddlebag on the bed. "It is not much, but it is clean and private. There is a washroom down the hall. We eat dinner at 6 o'clock every evening in the kitchen. You are welcome to join us, or I can have someone bring food to you if you prefer." "I will join you," Maeve said, looking around the room. It was simple but comfortable, with a real bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the ranch. It was more luxury than she had known in 2 years. "Good," Sterling said. He hesitated in the doorway as if he wanted to say something more, but then simply nodded and left, his boots echoing on the wooden floorboards. Maeve sat down on the bed and let out a long breath. Everything had happened so fast. Just 2 days ago, she had been struggling to keep her ranch going, and now she was living in a stranger's house, about to start a new life. It was overwhelming and frightening, and if she was honest with herself, a little bit exciting. She unpacked her few belongings and washed her face in the basin on the washstand. Then she went downstairs and out to the barn to find Thomas. He was already talking animatedly with Jack and another ranch hand, a young man named Ben who could not have been more than 19. They were discussing the best way to break a particularly stubborn Mustang that had been giving everyone trouble. "There you are," Thomas said when he saw her. "Jack was just telling me about all the work that needs doing around here. It sounds like we will be plenty busy." "That is good," Maeve said. "The busier we are, the faster we can work off our debt." Jack looked at her with something like respect. "You are a practical one, are not you? I like that. We will get along just fine, Miss Langford." Over the next few weeks, Maeve threw herself into the work with determination. She woke before dawn every morning and worked until well after dark, helping with everything from mending fences to herding cattle to mucking out stalls. The other ranch hands were initially skeptical of her, but she quickly proved herself capable and tireless, and they began to accept her as one of the crew. Sterling was often nearby, overseeing the work and pitching in where needed. Maeve found herself watching him more than she probably should, noticing the way he moved, the way he spoke to his men with respect and authority, the way he seemed to anticipate problems before they arose. He was a good boss, firm but fair, and his men clearly respected him. He was also maddeningly difficult to read. Sometimes Maeve would catch him looking at her with an expression she could not quite decipher. Other times, he seemed to go out of his way to avoid speaking to her directly, communicating through Jack instead. It was confusing and more than a little frustrating. One evening, about 3 weeks after they had arrived at the ranch, Maeve was in the kitchen helping the cook, a cheerful woman named Rosa, prepare dinner for the crew. Rosa had been initially hired just to cook for Sterling and the foreman, but as the operation grew, she had taken on feeding all the hands as well. "You are a hard worker," Rosa said approvingly as Maeve chopped vegetables with practiced efficiency. "Most women would have given up by now." "This is not easy life." "I have never been afraid of hard work," Maeve replied, "and I owe Mr. Rafferty a debt. I intend to repay it." Rosa made a thoughtful sound. "He is a good man, our Sterling. A little lonely, I think, but good." "Lonely," Maeve repeated, surprised. "He has a whole ranch full of people. People who work for him, yes," Rosa said. "But that is not the same as family, as friends. He keeps himself apart, you know, ever since his wife died." Maeve nearly dropped the knife. "His wife?" Rosa looked up, her eyes widening. "Oh, you did not know?" "Yes, he was married. It was before he came here, back in Colorado. She died in childbirth, along with the baby. It broke his heart. That is why he came to Montana, to start over where there were no memories." Maeve felt a strange tightness in her chest. Suddenly Sterling's quietness, his distance, made more sense. He had suffered a terrible loss and was still carrying that pain with him. "How long ago did this happen?" she asked quietly. 9 years, I think," Rosa said. "Maybe 10. He does not talk about it. Jack told me the story when I first came to work here, but he said Sterling never mentions her. It is like he has locked that part of his life away." They continued preparing the meal in silence, but Maeve's mind was racing. She found herself seeing Sterling in a different light now. The man who had stepped forward to pay her brother's bond was not just a wealthy rancher being generous. He was someone who understood loss and pain, someone who perhaps saw in her and Thomas a chance to help others the way he wished someone had helped him. That evening, after the meal was finished and the crew had dispersed to their various activities, Maeve found herself alone on the front porch of the house, watching the sun set over the mountains in the distance. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the air was finally beginning to cool after another scorching day. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Sterling standing in the doorway. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "It is your porch," Maeve said, then immediately felt foolish for the curt response. Sterling sat down on the steps, stretching his long legs out in front of him. For a while they both just watched the sunset in silence. Finally, Maeve said, "Rosa told me about your wife. I am sorry for your loss." Sterling's jaw tightened, and for a moment Maeve thought he was going to get up and walk away. But then he let out a slow breath. "It was a long time ago." "That does not make it hurt any less," Maeve said softly. "I lost my father 2 years ago, and I still think about him every day. I still expect to see him coming around the corner of the barn or hear his voice calling me for supper." Sterling looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them, an understanding that needed no words. "What was he like?" he asked. "Strong," Maeve said, smiling slightly at the memory. "And stubborn. He believed in working hard and keeping your word. He taught me and Thomas everything we know about ranching. When he died, it felt like the whole world had tilted sideways." "I know that feeling," Sterling said quietly. They sat in silence for a while longer, and Maeve found it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of quiet that exists between two people who understand each other without needing to fill every moment with words. "Why did you help us?" Maeve asked finally. "The real reason." Sterling was quiet for so long that Maeve thought he was not going to answer. Then he said, "Because when my wife died, I was alone. I had no family, no one to help me through it. I made mistakes, pushed people away, nearly destroyed everything I had built. If someone had stepped in, offered me a hand, maybe things would have been different. When I saw you in that courtroom, begging for your brother, I saw someone who needed help. I was in a position to give it, so I did." Maeve felt tears prick her eyes. "You are a good man, Sterling Rafferty." He shook his head. "I am just a man who knows what it is like to lose everything. I do not want that for you and your brother." "Thank you," Maeve whispered, "for everything." Sterling stood up, brushing dust off his pants. "You have earned your place here, Maeve. You and Thomas both. You work harder than some men I have had on this ranch for years. I am glad you came." He went inside, leaving Maeve alone with her thoughts and the fading light. Something had shifted between them tonight. Some invisible wall had come down, and Maeve found herself thinking about Sterling in a way she had not allowed herself to think about any man before. She pushed the thoughts away, reminding herself that she was here to work, to repay a debt, nothing more. But her heart, it seemed, had other ideas. The weeks passed, turning into a month, then 2. Thomas's trial date came, and they traveled back to Hecla for the proceedings. Chapman's witnesses fell apart under cross-examination by the lawyer Sterling had hired at his own expense, and Thomas was acquitted of all charges. The relief Maeve felt was overwhelming, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that things might actually work out. They returned to the Rafferty ranch and continued their work. Autumn arrived, painting the mountains in brilliant shades of gold and red. The cattle were brought down from the high pastures, and there was a frenzy of activity as everyone prepared for winter. Maeve worked alongside the men, learning skills she had never needed on her small ranch: how to properly castrate and brand calves, how to identify and treat various livestock diseases, how to predict weather patterns by watching the sky and the behavior of animals. Sterling was often nearby, teaching her things with a patience she had not expected. He showed her how to throw a lasso properly, how to shoe a horse, how to read trail signs. Sometimes their hands would brush as he demonstrated a technique, and Maeve would feel a jolt of electricity that left her breathless. She tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the work, but it was becoming harder with each passing day. She was falling in love with him. The realization came to her one crisp October morning as she watched him work with a young colt in the training corral. He was gentle but firm, speaking to the animal in a low, soothing voice, and there was something in his movements that was almost like a dance. He glanced up and caught her watching, and the smile he gave her made her heart skip a beat. This was dangerous. She was here to work off a debt, not to develop feelings for her employer. Sterling had been kind to her, had given her and Thomas a chance when no one else would, but that did not mean he saw her as anything more than a worker, someone to be helped out of pity. Except sometimes, when she caught him looking at her, she thought she saw something more in his eyes. Something warm and tender that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, he felt the same way she did. One evening in late October, after a long day of repairing fence lines, Maeve was walking back to the house when she heard raised voices coming from the barn. She recognized Sterling's voice and Jack's, and they sounded angry. She hesitated, not wanting to eavesdrop, but then Jack's words carried clearly across the yard. "You are a fool if you do not tell her, Sterling. I have seen the way you look at her, the way she looks at you. You are both dancing around each other like scared rabbits. I am her employer," Sterling said firmly. "She is working off a debt. It would not be right." "The debt is nearly paid," Jack argued. "You know they have worked more than enough to cover that bond and the horses and everything else. You are the one who keeps finding reasons to keep them here. If you care about her, tell her. If you do not, let her go." There was a long silence, and then Sterling said quietly, "I do care about her. More than I should. More than I have cared about anyone since Sarah died. But what if she does not feel the same way? What if she only stays because she thinks she owes me something? I cannot bear the thought of that." Maeve's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She backed away from the barn, not wanting to hear any more, and practically ran to the house. She went straight to her room and closed the door, leaning against it and trying to catch her breath. He cared about her. Sterling Rafferty cared about her. The knowledge filled her with a wild, desperate joy, but also with uncertainty. What should she do? Should she tell him how she felt? Should she wait for him to make the first move? What if Jack was wrong and Sterling's feelings were not as deep as she hoped? She barely slept that night, tossing and turning, playing out different scenarios in her mind. By morning, she had made a decision. She would tell him. Life was too short and too uncertain to waste time being afraid. If he rejected her, so be it, but at least she would know. She found him in the stable after breakfast, checking on a mare that was due to foal soon. He looked up when she entered, and something in her expression must have alerted him because he straightened, his eyes searching her face. "Sterling," she began, then faltered. This was harder than she had thought it would be. "What is wrong?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. He took a step toward her. "Did something happen?" "No, nothing is wrong. I just need to tell you something." She took a deep breath. "I heard you and Jack talking last night. I was not trying to eavesdrop, but I heard you say that you cared about me." Sterling went very still. "Maeve, let me finish," she said quickly, before she lost her nerve. "I know you think I might only care about you because of what you did for me and Thomas, because you helped us when we had nothing. But that is not why. I care about you because you are good and kind and patient, because you understand loss and pain, but you have not let it make you bitter. Because when you smile, which is not often enough, it feels like the sun coming out after a storm. I care about you," Sterling, and it has nothing to do with debt or gratitude. I care about you because of who you are." The silence that followed her declaration seemed to stretch on forever. Sterling stood frozen, his blue eyes locked on her face, and Maeve felt her courage start to waver. She had made a terrible mistake. She had misread everything. Then he was moving, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. He cupped her face in his rough, calloused hands and kissed her with a desperate intensity that took her breath away. Maeve melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, and for a moment the entire world disappeared. There was only Sterling, only the warmth of his body against hers, only the taste of his lips and the pounding of her heart. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sterling rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for months," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Every day I told myself I should not, that it was not right, that you deserved better than a broken man with too many ghosts. But I could not stop thinking about you. I could not stop wanting you." "You are not broken," Maeve said fiercely, her hands fisting in his shirt. "You are strong and whole and worthy of being loved, and I do love you, Sterling. I love you so much it scares me." He kissed her again, more gently this time, with a tenderness that made her want to cry. "I love you too," he whispered against her lips. "I have loved you almost from the moment I saw you in that courtroom, so fierce and determined. You have brought light back into my life, Maeve. You have made me want to hope again." They stood there for a long time, holding each other, neither wanting to let go. Finally, Sterling pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. "The debt is paid," he said firmly. "You and Thomas have worked more than enough to cover everything. You are free to go if you want to, but I am asking you to stay. Not as my employee, but as my partner. As the woman I love and want to build a life with." "I am not going anywhere," Maeve promised. "This is where I belong, with you." Sterling's smile, when it came, was brilliant and unguarded, and Maeve thought she had never seen anything more beautiful in her life. That evening, they told Thomas and Jack and the rest of the crew. Thomas was delighted, pumping Sterling's hand enthusiastically and hugging his sister, until she protested that he was going to break her ribs. Jack wore a satisfied smirk, as if he had known all along how things would turn out. The other ranch hands offered their congratulations, and Rosa wiped happy tears from her eyes. "I knew it," she said, beaming at them both. "I told Jack weeks ago that you two were meant for each other. I am never wrong about these things." The next few months were the happiest of Maeve's life. She and Sterling spent every moment they could together, talking and laughing and making plans for the future. He showed her all his favorite places on the ranch. A hidden valley where wildflowers bloomed in spring, a clear stream where trout could be caught, a high ridge that offered a view of the entire property and the mountains beyond. They married in January of 1884, in a simple ceremony in Hecla with Thomas and Jack and Rosa as witnesses. Judge Whitmore, who had set Thomas's bond all those months ago, performed the ceremony with a grudging respect. It seemed even he had heard about how hard Maeve and Thomas had worked at the Rafferty ranch, and he could not help but approve of the match. Maeve wore a new dress that Sterling had insisted on buying for her, a beautiful blue silk that made her eyes shine. Sterling wore his best suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his blue eyes full of love and joy as he said his vows. When he kissed her as his wife for the first time, Maeve felt like her heart might burst with happiness. They returned to the ranch that evening and had a celebration with all the hands. There was music and dancing and more food than they could possibly eat. Sterling danced with Maeve under the stars, holding her close and whispering sweet words in her ear that made her blush and laugh. That night, in the bedroom they would now share, Sterling made love to her with a gentleness and passion that left her trembling. He touched her as if she were something precious, something to be cherished, and Maeve gave herself to him completely, holding nothing back. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, and Sterling told her about Sarah, his first wife, really told her for the first time. She was young, he said quietly. Only 19 when we married. I was 22. We thought we had all the time in the world. When she got pregnant, we were so happy. We picked out names, made plans. But the baby came early and something went wrong. The doctor tried everything, but he could not save either of them. I held her as she died, and I felt like my whole world was ending. Maeve kissed his shoulder, her heart aching for the pain he had endured. I am so sorry. For a long time, I thought I would never feel anything again, Sterling continued. I thought that part of me had died with her. But then I met you, and you made me feel alive again. You gave me a reason to hope, to dream about the future. I will always love Sarah and remember what we had, but you are my future, Maeve. You are my heart. And you are mine, Maeve whispered. Always. They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, and Maeve thought she had never felt so safe, so loved, so completely at peace. The months that followed were busy and productive. With Maeve and Thomas both working as full partners in the ranch, the operation grew and prospered. They bought more cattle, expanded the horse breeding program, and hired additional hands. Thomas proved to have a natural gift for training horses, and soon people were coming from as far away as Wyoming to buy animals he had worked with. In the spring, Maeve discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with both joy and fear. She knew what had happened to Sterling's first wife, knew that childbirth was dangerous, but Sterling held her close and promised that everything would be all right. We will get the best doctor money can buy, he said. And I will be with you every step of the way. You are strong, Maeve, stronger than anyone I have ever known. You can do this. The pregnancy was not easy. Maeve suffered from terrible morning sickness in the early months and was exhausted all the time. But Sterling was true to his word, never leaving her side unless absolutely necessary, bringing her whatever she needed, rubbing her aching back and swollen feet. Thomas hovered anxiously, treating his sister like she was made of glass, until Maeve finally had to tell him to stop being ridiculous. I am pregnant, not dying, she said with exasperation. I can still work. I can still live my life. But as the months passed and her belly grew large, she had to admit that some tasks were beyond her. Sterling insisted she stay close to the house, and Jack took over most of her outdoor duties. It chafed at Maeve's independent spirit, but she knew they were right to be cautious. In December of 1884, on a cold night with snow falling softly outside, Maeve went into labor. The doctor, a capable man named Henry Paulson, who Sterling had brought in from Helena, was already at the ranch, having been staying there for the past week in anticipation of the birth. Rosa and a midwife named Catherine assisted him, and Sterling refused to leave Maeve's side despite the women's protests that the birthing room was no place for a husband. She is my wife, he said firmly. I am staying. The labor was long and difficult, lasting well into the next day. Maeve gritted her teeth and bore down when told to, trying not to scream, trying to be strong. But the pain was overwhelming, and there were moments when she thought she could not continue. Moments when she saw fear flicker in Sterling's eyes and knew he was remembering Sarah. You can do this, he kept saying, holding her hand so tightly she thought her bones might break. You are the strongest woman I know. You can do this, Maeve. I love you. You can do this. And somehow, impossibly, she did. With one final push that felt like it would tear her apart, the baby came into the world, screaming with healthy lungs. Dr. Paulson held up a red, wrinkled, beautiful little creature. It is a boy, he announced with satisfaction. a strong, healthy boy. Sterling was crying, tears streaming down his face, and Maeve reached up to touch his cheek. "We have a son," she whispered, exhausted but elated. "We have a son," Sterling repeated, wonder in his voice. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. Thank you for this gift." They named him Samuel, after Maeve's father, with the middle name James, after Sterling's father. Little Samuel Rafferty came into the world loved and wanted, surrounded by family who would protect him and cherish him always. Thomas was beside himself with joy at becoming an uncle. He rode into town the next day to send telegrams announcing the birth to everyone they knew. Jack carved a beautiful wooden cradle as a gift. Rosa made tiny clothes and blankets. The ranch hands took turns peeking in at the baby, their rough faces softening at the sight of the infant. Maeve recovered slowly from the birth, but she was healthy and strong, just as Sterling had said. She spent the winter months bonding with her son, marveling at his tiny fingers and toes, his serious blue eyes that looked so much like his father's. Sterling was a devoted father, getting up in the night to help with feedings, changing diapers without complaint, singing lullabies in a surprisingly pleasant baritone. As spring arrived and Samuel grew bigger and more alert, Maeve felt her strength returning. She began taking short walks around the property, the baby bundled against her chest in a sling Rosa had made. She showed him the horses and cattle, the mountains in the distance, the creek where his father had taught her to fish. Samuel gurgled and cooed, his small hands grasping at everything within reach. "He's going to grow up loving this land as much as we do," Sterling said one evening as they sat on the porch together, watching the sunset while Samuel slept peacefully in his cradle nearby. "He will learn to ride and rope and work cattle. He will know what it means to build something with your own hands. He will also know what it means to be loved," Maeve added, leaning her head on Sterling's shoulder. "To have a family who would do anything for him. To have a father who is strong and kind and honorable." Sterling wrapped his arm around her and pulled her close. "He will have all of that because he has you for a mother. You are the heart of this family, Maeve. You are what holds us all together." 2 years passed in a blur of activity and happiness. The ranch continued to prosper, and Sterling began buying up adjacent properties, expanding their holdings. Thomas met a young woman named Elizabeth from town and began courting her seriously. Jack remarried, having been a widower for many years, to a schoolteacher named Margaret. Samuel grew into an energetic toddler with his father's blue eyes and his mother's stubborn determination. He was walking and talking early, and he loved nothing more than being outside, chasing chickens and trying to pet every horse he saw. In the spring of 1886, Maeve discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and in the fall she gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Catherine, honoring both Sterling's first wife and the midwife who had helped bring Samuel into the world. Sterling held his daughter and wept, not with sorrow this time but with joy, and Maeve knew that the ghosts of his past had finally been laid to rest. Thomas married Elizabeth that winter in a beautiful ceremony at the church in Hecla. Maeve stood beside her brother, holding Samuel's hand and carrying little Sarah in her arms, and thought about how far they had come. Just 3 years ago, they had been desperate and alone, on the verge of losing everything. Now they were surrounded by love and family, with a future full of promise. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. They had 2 more children, twin boys named Michael and Matthew, born in 1888. The ranch grew to be one of the largest and most successful in Montana. Thomas and Elizabeth had children of their own, 3 daughters who adored their cousins and spent every summer at the Rafferty ranch, running wild through the fields and learning to ride. On a warm evening in June of 1893, Maeve sat on the porch with Sterling, watching their children play in the yard. Samuel, now 8 years old, was teaching his younger siblings how to skip stones in the creek. Sarah, at 6, was bossy and determined, organizing the twins into some complicated game. Their laughter filled the air, sweet as music. "Do you ever think about that day in the courtroom?" Maeve asked Sterling. "The day you stepped forward and changed everything." Sterling smiled and took her hand, raising it to his lips. "I think about it all the time. It was the best decision I ever made." "I was so angry at first," Maeve admitted, "so suspicious of your motives. I could not understand why anyone would help us without wanting something in return." "I did want something in return," Sterling said. "I just did not know it at the time. I wanted a family. I wanted love. I wanted a reason to wake up in the morning with hope instead of dread. You gave me all of that, Maeve. You and our children." Maeve leaned against him, feeling his solid presence, his warmth. "I begged the judge to free my brother, and you paid the bond and asked for nothing back. But you got everything anyway. We both did." "We did," Sterling agreed. "We got everything and more." They sat together as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. The children's laughter continued, mixed with the sounds of cattle lowing in the distance and horses whinnying in the barn. It was a good life, a full life, built on the foundation of courage and sacrifice and love. 10 more years passed, and the new century arrived. Samuel grew into a fine young man who took over much of the ranch management, allowing Sterling and Maeve to slow down a bit. Sarah became a talented horsewoman who won competitions across the state. The twins were inseparable, always getting into mischief but with good hearts underneath. Thomas and Elizabeth's daughters were frequent visitors, and eventually one of them, a spirited girl named Anna, caught Samuel's eye. They married in 1902, and the cycle continued. A new generation learning the land and building their own dreams. Sterling's dark hair had gone gray at the temples, and lines had deepened around his eyes. But to Maeve he was as handsome as the day she first saw him in that courtroom. Her own face showed the marks of time and sun and laughter, but Sterling told her often that she grew more beautiful with each passing year. On their 20th anniversary, Sterling surprised her with a trip to Denver, just the two of them. They stayed in a fancy hotel, ate at fine restaurants, and went to the theater. It was wonderful, but Maeve found herself missing the ranch, missing their children, missing the life they had built together. "Are you happy?" Sterling asked her one night as they walked through the city streets, hand in hand like young lovers. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," Maeve replied honestly. "I have everything I could ever want. A husband I love more than life itself. Beautiful children who make me proud every day. A home and a purpose. What more could anyone ask for?" "Nothing," Sterling said, pulling her close. "There is nothing more. We have been blessed, Maeve, so incredibly blessed." They returned to the ranch, to their children and grandchildren, to the land they loved and the life they had built. And as the years continued to roll by, bringing new challenges and new joys, they faced everything together, hand in hand, heart to heart. Sterling lived to be 72 years old, dying peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1925 with Maeve beside him. In his final days, he told her he had no regrets, that his life had been full and rich beyond measure, that knowing her and loving her had been the greatest adventure of his life. Maeve mourned him deeply, as did their children and grandchildren and everyone who had known him. But she did not give in to despair. She continued to live on the ranch, watching her family grow and thrive, secure in the knowledge that Sterling's legacy would continue for generations. She often thought about that day in the courtroom, about how one act of kindness had changed everything. Sterling had stepped forward when no one else would, had offered help without expecting anything in return, and in doing so he had saved not just Thomas but her as well. He had given her hope when she had none, love when she thought she would never find it, a future when she could see only darkness. And she had given him the same gifts in return. They had saved each other, healed each other, built a life together that neither could have created alone. When Maeve passed away in 1937 at the age of 78, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, her last thoughts were of Sterling. She could almost feel his hand in hers, almost hear his voice telling her he loved her, almost see his blue eyes smiling at her with that look of deep tenderness that had never faded. She had begged the judge to free her brother. Sterling had paid the bond and asked for nothing back. But in the end, they had both received more than they could have imagined. They had found love in an unexpected place, had built a family and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. It was, Maeve thought as she drew her final breath, a very good story. Their story. And it had been worth every moment. The Rafferty ranch continued to operate for many years after Maeve's death, passed down through the generations, each one adding their own chapters to the family history. The original house that Sterling had built was preserved and cherished, and in the front room, on a shelf of honor, sat a photograph of Sterling and Maeve taken on their wedding day. They looked young and happy and so deeply in love that everyone who saw the picture could not help but smile. And sometimes, on warm summer evenings when the breeze whispered through the Montana grass, and the sun painted the mountains gold, the current generation of Raffertys would gather on that same front porch where Sterling and Maeve had sat so many times, and they would tell stories about the remarkable couple who had started it all. They would talk about how Maeve had begged a judge to free her brother, and how a cowboy named Sterling Rafferty had stepped forward to pay the bond, asking for nothing in return. They would talk about how that single act of kindness had blossomed into a love story that spanned decades, how it had created a family and a legacy that endured. And the children would listen with wide eyes, learning that sometimes the greatest treasures come from the simplest acts of compassion, that love can grow in the most unexpected places, and that courage and kindness are worth more than all the gold in the world. The story of Sterling and Maeve Rafferty became legend in Montana, passed down not just in their own family but throughout the community. It was a reminder that in a hard land during hard times, there was still room for love and generosity, for second chances and new beginnings. Samuel, their eldest son, had his own children tell the story to their children, and so on through the generations. Each retelling added new details, new perspectives, but the heart of the story remained the same. A desperate woman, a wrongfully accused brother, a mysterious cowboy who stepped forward when no one else would. And from that meeting in a dusty courtroom in Hecla, Montana, in the summer of 1883, a love had grown that changed everything. The ranch itself stood as a monument to their love. Every fence post Sterling had set with his own hands, every building he had constructed, every field he had cleared was maintained and honored by those who came after. The horses that descended from his original breeding stock were still prized throughout the region. The cattle that bore the Rafferty brand were known for their quality and hardiness. But more than the physical legacy, it was the values that Sterling and Maeve had instilled in their family that truly endured. Honesty, hard work, compassion for those in need, and above all, the understanding that love was the most important thing of all. These principles guided each new generation, helping them navigate their own challenges and build their own lives. Anna, who had married Samuel, often told her grandchildren about the day she first met Sterling and Maeve. They had this way of looking at each other, she would say, her eyes distant with memory. Even after all those years of marriage, after raising children and building an empire, they still looked at each other like they were young lovers seeing each other for the first time. That is what I want for all of you. Not just someone to share your life with, but someone who makes you believe in magic. The town of Hecla itself changed over the years, growing from a small frontier settlement into a proper town with paved streets and electric lights. But the courthouse where Maeve had begged for her brother's freedom remained, and locals would point it out to visitors, telling them the story of the Raffertys. Judge Whitmore, who had set the bond that day, became something of a footnote in the tale. He lived another 15 years after Sterling paid Thomas's bond, and in that time he often saw the Rafferty family in town. He never admitted it publicly, but he told his wife once that he had been wrong about the Langfords, and that Sterling Rafferty had been a better judge of character than he had been. Thomas himself lived a long and happy life, raising his daughters on a ranch adjacent to his sister's. He never forgot that it was Sterling's generosity that had saved him from prison, and he worked tirelessly to prove himself worthy of that faith. His relationship with Samuel, his nephew, was particularly close, and the two of them expanded the Rafferty holdings significantly in the early 1900s. Elizabeth, Thomas's wife, became one of Maeve's closest friends. The two women spent countless hours together, raising their children, working on the ranches, and supporting each other through the challenges of life on the frontier. When Maeve's children were grown and had children of their own, it was Elizabeth who sat with her on the porch and reminisced about the old days, about how strange and wonderful their lives had turned out to be. Rosa, the cook who had first told Maeve about Sterling's tragic past, remained with the family until her death in 1910. She was considered part of the family, and when she passed away, she was buried in the Rafferty family plot with full honors. Her recipes were preserved and passed down, and to this day, certain dishes served at family gatherings were still made Rosa's way. Jack Donovan, Sterling's faithful foreman, worked at the ranch until he was too old to ride anymore. He and his second wife, Margaret, lived in a cottage on the property, and Jack spent his final years teaching the younger generation everything he knew about ranching, horses, and life. He was present at Sterling's deathbed, one of the few people allowed in the room besides immediate family, and he wept openly at the passing of his friend. The bond that Sterling had paid, $500 that had seemed like an impossible sum to Maeve and Thomas in 1883, became something of a family joke in later years. Sterling had long since written it off, refusing to take any payment from them, insisting that their work and their presence in his life was worth far more than any amount of money. But the family never forgot the sacrifice he had made, the risk he had taken on two strangers based solely on his faith in human decency. In 1933, on the 50th anniversary of the day Sterling had paid the bond, Samuel organized a massive celebration at the ranch. All of Sterling and Maeve's descendants gathered, along with friends and neighbors from across Montana. Sterling was gone by then, but Maeve, though frail, was present, sitting in a place of honor and beaming as her family toasted her and the love story she had shared with Sterling. "My husband was the bravest man I ever knew," she said in a speech that day, her voice thin but clear. "Not because he could rope a steer or break a wild horse or build a ranch from nothing, though he could do all those things. He was brave because he was willing to risk his heart again after it had been broken. He was brave because he chose to help strangers when he had no reason to. He was brave because he loved me every day of our lives together, even when I was difficult or stubborn or impossible." The crowd laughed, and Maeve smiled. "But I like to think I was brave too. I was brave enough to accept help when I needed it. I was brave enough to trust a stranger. I was brave enough to love again after I thought my whole world had ended. And together, Sterling and I built something that will last long after we are both gone. We built a family based on love and trust and hard work, and I could not be more proud of all of you who carry on that legacy." There was not a dry eye in the crowd when she finished speaking. And as the party continued into the night, with music and dancing and storytelling, everyone present understood that they were part of something special, something that had started with a simple act of kindness 50 years before. Maeve lived 4 more years after that celebration, each one precious and full of meaning. She spent her final days much as she had spent the middle years of her life, surrounded by family, secure in the knowledge that she had lived well and loved deeply. When she closed her eyes for the last time, it was with a smile on her face and peace in her heart. They buried her next to Sterling on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a stand of cottonwood trees that had been planted the year Samuel was born. The headstone was simple but elegant, bearing both their names and the dates of their long lives, and beneath that, a single line that Samuel had chosen. They helped each other home. And that was the truth of it, really. Sterling and Maeve had helped each other home, had helped each other heal, had helped each other become the people they were meant to be. What had started as a desperate plea in a courtroom and a generous response from a stranger had become one of the great love stories of the American West. The years continued to march on, as they always do. The ranch adapted to new times, incorporating modern technology while still maintaining the traditions that Sterling and Maeve had established. The descendants spread out across the country, though many returned to Montana, drawn by the pull of their heritage and the stories of their remarkable ancestors. In 1983, exactly 100 years after Sterling had paid Thomas's bond, the family held another celebration. By this time, there were over 200 living descendants of Sterling and Maeve Rafferty. They came from all over the United States, some from as far away as New York and California, drawn together by their shared history and the legacy of love that had started it all. The original ranch house had been preserved as a museum of sorts, maintained exactly as it had been in Sterling and Maeve's time. Visitors could walk through the rooms where they had lived and loved, see the furniture they had used, the books Sterling had read, the clothes Maeve had worn. In the master bedroom, carefully preserved under glass, was the blue silk dress Maeve had worn on her wedding day, still beautiful after all these years. And in the front room, that photograph of their wedding day still held pride of place, a reminder of where it all began. Young Sterling, handsome and serious, standing beside young Maeve, beautiful and radiant, both of them looking at the camera but clearly only seeing each other. The story of Sterling and Maeve Rafferty was told and retold, becoming part of the folklore of Montana. A reminder that even in the hardest times, even in the roughest places, love could bloom and flourish. It was a story about second chances, about the power of kindness, about the courage it takes to open your heart after it has been broken. But most of all, it was a story about 2 people who found each other at exactly the right moment when they both needed saving, and who built a life together that neither could have imagined. A life full of hard work and challenges, yes, but also full of laughter and joy and deep, abiding love. And in the end, is that not what we all hope for? Someone to help us home, someone to stand beside us through the storms, someone to build dreams with, to raise children with, to grow old with, someone who sees us at our worst and loves us anyway. Someone who makes us believe in magic even when the world seems dark and difficult. Sterling and Maeve had that. Against all odds, coming from places of pain and loss, they had found each other and built something beautiful and lasting. Their love story, which began on a dusty August day in 1883, when a woman begged a judge to free her brother and a cowboy paid the bond and asked for nothing back, became a beacon for all who came after. Proof that love can heal even the deepest wounds, that kindness can change everything, and that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most unexpected places. And so the story ends where all good stories should end, with love triumphant, with family thriving, with a legacy that will endure for generations to come. Sterling and Maeve Rafferty lived and loved and died, as all people must, but what they created together, the family they built and the values they instilled, and the love they shared, that will never die. It will live on in every Rafferty who rides the Montana plains, in every child who learns the story of how their ancestors met, in every couple who looks at each other with that same deep love that Sterling and Maeve shared. It will live on in the land itself, in the ranch that still bears their name, in the mountains that watch over it all. And perhaps, on warm summer evenings when the light is just right and the wind whispers through the grass, if you stand on that hill where Sterling and Maeve are buried and listen very carefully, you might hear the echo of laughter, the sound of children playing, the gentle voices of two people who loved each other across decades and beyond death itself, still telling their story to anyone who will listen. For this is their happily ever after, not a fairy tale ending where nothing bad ever happens, but something better. A real ending where two imperfect people found each other and chose to love each other through everything life threw at them. Where they built something that mattered, raised children who carried on their values, and left the world better than they found it. That is the story of how Maeve begged the judge to free her brother, of how Sterling paid the bond and asked for nothing back, and of how they both received everything they had ever wanted and more. It is a story of the American West, of hard times and harder choices, but above all, it is a love story, pure and simple and true. And it is a story with the best possible ending. They lived, they loved, they triumphed, and they were happy. The end.